Alright, project management students, today we are going to be hitting into chapter 2, which is all about putting our project management philosophy into context. Now, we're talking about information technology as a context, but I want to make the point that this entire class, that all the lectures we're going to be talking about are applicable to any kind of project work. We may be talking a little bit about the software or systems development lifecycle today, but keep in mind the core principles we're talking about still apply to any project. A well-run project is a well-run project regardless. But let's jump in. We're going to talk a little bit about the systems view of project management. Keep in mind, we start talking about information systems. Information systems came from the original term systems, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the term and where it came from. We're also going to talk about some politics here in terms of the 4 frames of the organization and how those frames of organizational thinking frame everything we talk about. We're also going to talk more about some of the conversations we started about why it's important to get management and stakeholders on board. Regardless of how high-tech we get, until Skynet takes over and we are all servants of robot overlords, we're still in control of the technology. And as a result, we've got to deal with people, and people have to be engaged in the process. We're going to talk about why that's important, even though we're talking tech today, too. We're also going to talk about the distinguishing differences between project and product life cycles. Not as complex as it might sound. We're going to also talk about some of the different ways IT projects work, in particular, how we manage modern teams, given that we are not generally operating all in one place anymore. So let's start talking a little bit about what we mean when we talk about systems, a systems view. Anytime a project is operating within a company, it's operating what we refer to as an organizational environment. There are ways that things get done. There are decisions that get made. We have systems that make things happen. So when we start talking about this kind of process, we're also thinking about what we refer to as a holistic view. And that means we've got to look at how projects and how technology exists within a company or an organization as a whole. For example, there are some companies that technology is the reason for existence. If you're Google, you're a very tech-centric culture. If you're education, although we make heavy use of technology, we are not per se a technology culture. So we've got a different way in which systems fit into our culture, possibly even in the background. We can trace the lineage of the systems approach back to the 1950s. Automation was really beginning to take place with some competing cultures happening between a large group of men who had come back from the war, populating the workforce from the mid-1940s into the 50s, combined with increasing technology and automation. All of a sudden we had competing systems of doing things and accomplishing tasks. The systems men started coming in and looking at ways in which we could maximize efficiency, making best use of people and technology. So if you look back at people like Hertzberg and Maslow who were talking about organizational hierarchies, these folks were talking about systems hierarchy. So the general philosophy was the systems philosophy, meaning everything fits together at some point. Whether you're talking about building cars or running organizations, there are ways in which systems fit together. There are ways that parts of companies are compartmentalized. They developed something which would later be known as systems analysis, which is the idea of getting into a system and determining where the flaws are, where we have opportunities for improvement, or if something isn't working well, specifically how can we fix it. This also went on to another discipline called systems management, which basically means that we are going to look homeopathically, as we mentioned in the previous slide, at how all these systems intersect and how all these different components of systems, such as business, technology, and organizational issues intersect before we make changes to the systems. Here's my point. We can have the world's best designed system, something that is designed for peak efficiency, that makes no errors. If it is impossible for end users to make good use of, or if they have another cultural issue while they will not adopt it, the system itself may never be adopted. Technology is not always based on logic. In the 1980s, there were 2 competing formats for videotape. One was VHS, the other was Beta. Beta was a higher definition, better quality picture, but VHS had better market penetration. There were some people who would also argue that the HD discs were better than Blu-ray, for example, that we had higher quality HD standards than Blu-ray, but Blu-ray took off largely because of its affiliation with Sony and the association with the Sony PlayStation. So a lot of people got their first Blu-ray players as Sony PlayStations, meaning that format took over the market. So sometimes the issues that can result in systems dominance have little to do with actual technical performance. So this takes us to what we refer to as the three-spear model for systems management. So we've got three things that cross over. We've got business, organization, and technology. So the business is basically, what is it going to cost for us to do an upgrade, or how does our business work? The organization itself comes down to how does this technology or change affect the people who are going to use it. And the technology part of this is what specific technologies are going to work well. For example, in school districts, we have choices whether or not we're going to use laptops or whether we're going to use Chromebooks. Chromebooks that are incredibly reliant on connection to the internet. There could be technology issues there. Do we have good connection to the internet, or will these devices be useless for big parts of the day? An issue on the organization side of things would be, are individuals ready to adapt to a new operating system? If they're used to Microsoft, will they adapt to Chromebooks? And on the business side of things, is this something that financially and support-wise is going to fit within our organization? So all three of these areas cross over. So things to think about. If we are trying to understand how our business fits together, and we're trying to understand the business and organizational aspects. So let's say you are an IT professional. This still comes down to personal skills. In other words, instead of just technology, listen to people. I used to run an IT department many moons ago. And one of the basic philosophies I always tried to instill in my technical support staff was to speak in common English to try to get to the root of the problem. Many times in technology, we IT professionals will hide behind technology jargon instead of trying to really understand things in common speak. So focus on problems, focus on organizational objectives. Don't just make it about the technology. Technology for the sake of technology is not a solution. If you are getting into the organization, get with your boss, your supervisor, and other mentors and really understand how the organization works. I think a lot of us in technology, for example, tend to assume that people can just adapt. Or adapt, I should say. If it's a great tool, people will want to use it. Something as simple as making a transition from a legacy email program to Gmail sometimes can seem catastrophic to people. In addition, you still need personal networking. And here's what I want to explain there. From getting people on your side who are enthusiastic about change or enthusiastic about revising a system, to getting opinion leaders who will help you get buy-in to learn the systems, and even finding out what the actual resistance is. Well, as we'll talk about later in this chapter, sometimes these things have nothing to do with technology and everything to do with politics. So we'll talk more about that. The bottom line is, get out of your technical brain when you're thinking about systems from time to time. So in terms of understanding the organization, the most difficult thing at times is to understand the way the technology really fits with your organization. Technology is easy. And let me put that in context. I don't mean that every line of code is easy. I don't mean that understanding how to do every system upgrade is easy. I mean it's logical and it's linear and it's based on logic. People, however, are not. Technology is easy, I used to say. People are hard. So if you can understand the organization and the people within it and why they have resistance to change, or why they are afraid of the projects that you're trying to undertake, if you can understand those people and alleviate their fears, you'll have higher rates of success. And the bottom line is, if you can be the person who makes things easy and eliminates suffering, you will always find a place in an organization. It will improve the rate of success of your IT projects. So we start talking about the 4 frames of organization. This is important to know. We have a formal structural frame. Who works for whom? What is your title? What is it that you actually do? How do you fit within an organization? Then we've got a human resources frame. And this is the way that people interact, the way that our human resources departments develop people and resolve conflict, the way that we interact with each other. Then we've got political frames. Politics is a word that often gets associated as being bad or evil. All politics ultimately is the exercise of power. And power can be used for good or evil. It can be used for productive and counterproductive reasons. It can be used to advance progress in an organization or to push a personal agenda. And the symbolic frame is the things we do. What message are we sending to the organization? Let me give you an example. If we were a Microsoft shop, our organization had staunch opposition to Apple products, and the CEO or the boss or the president shows up at a high-profile meeting using a Mac laptop that could symbolize that things have changed. Sometimes the symbology is subtle, but we send messages. If somebody reports a problem on the production line and blows a whistle, and we punish that person for pointing out a flaw, then we're sending the symbolic message that people should keep quiet and deal with problems with production, maybe even corruption. Rewarding people for doing the right thing is a part of the symbolic frame as well. So again, these are all ways which our organizations function. It's basic organizational management, but it affects the way we manage projects. So our folks in our text love to give us examples of how projects go wrong. The bottom line here, in addition to the fact that sometimes we do poor jobs up front with IT projects and really doing estimates, sometimes people don't think of organizations in general. We miss the culture. One of my favorite examples, in the federal government, the government was working with a contractor. NASA was working with a contractor on a satellite. And when they got to the production phase of the satellite, NASA and the subcontractor realized one had been writing specs in English units, one had been writing them in metric. And it took several $1 million of recalculations to fix the mistake. So sometimes the mistakes that cost us the most money can be based on the most fundamental of issues. And all the technology in the world sometimes cannot fix a dysfunctional culture. So yes, organizational structures can cause problems in project work. So this is one of my favorite examples of how sometimes a company can over or underestimate the role of technology. Anybody who knows me, and I know some of the folks who are taking this class probably are not from Pennsylvania. We've got a big chain of convenience stores called Sheetz, and anybody who knows me knows I love Sheetz, and I drink a lot of coffee. I like fake sweetener and cream in my coffee. Don't hate me. That's the way I drink my coffee. And several years ago, Sheetz decided that the standard ways of having people sweeten and trim up their coffee with cream weren't good enough, so they came up with automated push-button digital coffee flavor and cream and sugar dispensers. The day they rolled these out, they actually had to have members of Sheetz staff on site to show people how to put cream and sugar in their coffee. It took longer to use the machines even after you knew how to use them than the old manual process actually did. The bottom line is this was a solution for a problem that didn't exist. And ultimately, most of the machines have come back out. Sheetz realized the error of their way and being too fetishized on the technology and not really the problem. So that was an example of how sometimes the culture of the organization and the project don't necessarily jive. So in terms of organizational structures, there are lots of different ways we can refer to organizations, whether they're vertical or horizontal or flat. You can take your pick. From a project management standpoint, we refer to functional project and matrix types of structures. So in a functional structure, we've got a typical hierarchical structure. So you report back to the CEO, the lead of the company. If we somewhat distribute this into a project structure, we've got program managers or maybe even portfolio managers reporting back to the CEO. So we're distributing the responsibility somewhat. If we get into a true matrix organization, then we are getting into the idea of truly distributed project management organizations with autonomous leads, people who are free to run projects on their own. It can be very complicated, and it can also result in a weak management structure. Here's an example how these functional structures work. Again, or I should say organizational structures. A typical functional structure is very hierarchical. If you're working in engineering, manufacturing, or however you break out your units, these VPs are managing their own projects and reporting back to the CEO. The second one, we've got program managers who are making use of staff and reporting back to the CEO. And the matrix structure gets a little bit more complicated. When we've got program managers and VPs mixed into these organizations, program managers, however, may be managing some of the same staff that the other VPs are managing as well and pulling them off for specific projects. People who support the matrix structure say that we can make more effective and constant use of staff. People who are against it say it gets hairy and inefficient to try to manage multiple people through multiple bosses. And again, I leave it up to your own discretion and research to determine what you think is the right structure. That ties us into our next subject, which is organizational culture. Organizational culture is something that evolves over time. It's our collective consciousness in the organization. It's what we value, what we believe. For example, St. Francis's organizational culture is one of openness, sharing, learning, warmth, and patience. Probably not so much in a company like IBM. IBM's a highly competitive company that deals in bottom lines and profits. So we have different organizational cultures that have developed over time. And some folks believe, for example, that the way you set up a company, whatever kind of structure you use, if you use a matrix or a functional or a program structure, has less to do with the success of a company than the culture. I think there's some merit to this discussion. BlackBerry, who I always like making reference to, is a great example how the mighty hath fallen. Owned the smartphone market at the dawn of the 21st century, and as of 2018 had less than 1% of global market share. There are articles that said that BlackBerry had the most toxic corporate culture in the world, completely stratified, completely resistant to change, and so hierarchical it was impossible to make change happen. People have said similar things about GM. The recent ignition scandal, where cars were shutting off in the middle of traffic, could have been fixed by a 50-cent part, and the problem was common knowledge throughout the company for over a decade. That's examples of toxic culture. So if the culture can override the structure, there is an argument to be made that the culture can be a bigger and more pervasive problem. So what are some characteristics of organizational culture? Again, our text does a nice job with these. And they opine that project work is most successful with certain characteristics in place and functioning well. Member identity. That means we feel like we're part of the organization. The group emphasis means that we are pulling for the team. Unit integration means we're pulling for our particular part of the organization. A risk tolerance means that we all share a shared skin in the game kind of mentality, that we have a similar opinion about how much risk, how much we're willing to lose. Same reward criteria. Do we believe we have a chance at actually being rewarded for our efforts, that it's going to be commensurate with the effort we put in? What about conflict tolerance? Conflict in organizations gets maligned. It's not necessarily a bad thing. When people fight, it can mean that they are passionate about their cause, and good things can come out of conflict if it's managed well. And an open system focus means that the superficial or the surface level way in which we're operating is the real operations of the organization. There are many organizations that are completely legal that still have a different surface culture and a different true culture, where the organization actually engages what we refer as doublethink, where we've got organizations who on the surface appear ethical and well run, but in reality, politics behind the scenes make things happen. Organizations that have a very open and sincere focus, where people are able to operate under a common set of rules, tend to be more successful when it comes to project management. Another point, we talk about stakeholders, and we'll talk a whole chapter about stakeholder management. Your stakeholders should be a big part of the focus of your project. After all, if you've got a project sponsor and people who are being affected by the work you're doing, then you better be hitting their needs as well, or they're not going to be satisfied with the project. A stakeholder, for example, who's a CEO in a for-profit company, probably wants to make a profit. A stakeholder in a system upgrade, for example, who might be a member of the rank and file, wants an easier system to use. For example, keep those folks in your mind at all times when you're managing the project. If you make them happy, you're going to have a better run organization as well. So why is it important for management to be committed? Well, the simple answer is that money and decisions have to come from someplace. I would not want to be engaged in a high-profile, high-cost project where the management and purse holders of the company were not engaged and not in support. The old adage is, you know what rolls downhill. So get management involved. Nobody wants to be in an oppositional stance to their own management. If you don't have managerial support, your projects will fail. I have been in organizations where managers, rather than supporting their staff, would enjoy pointing out their failures. They produce toxic cultures, and as a result, employees learn very, very quickly not to bother trying to integrate. If people fear failure too much, no innovative thought will come. You need to have supportive management. Those are the folks who can give you the resources, who can approve the ones and zeros and sign the documents that you need signed, and also give you support by connecting you to the right parts of the company. If you've got a really well-run company, these individuals will be willing to serve as mentors and to show you the ropes as well. I don't know how your organization is, but I know my organization, St. Francis University, to whom I am very committed, indebted, and a place I love to work, still has its quirks. There are things that you have to learn by learning the culture, and as you get promoted and moved into management, there are things that don't show up in the user manual or in the employee guides that you need mentored on. It's the same with any organization. So why do organizations need to commit to information technology? I think what it comes down to is this is becoming less of an issue as we move further into the 21st century, and all companies are realizing the value of IT. But IT really has to integrate. I think one of the problems or mistakes we've made in the past is making IT almost seem like a separate part of the organization. The strange guys and girls who show up and fix our computers. No, they need to be a part of the conversation, a part of the organization. And I think the other part of it is we're past the point where we should just be fascinated with technology for the sake of technology. Technology should be empowering and a key part of the organization. The other interesting part that I think comes into a systems analysis and design issue, if you include non-IT people in your conversations about information technology, they may give you some of the best feedback in the world. Sometimes an outside perspective will make you look at a problem in a way you haven't before, and the solutions may be closer than you think by having a separate set of eyes. So that's why we need to be more integrated with organizations. That being said, we also need organizational standards. And what I'm referring to here is, how do we communicate? How do we document our projects? How do we keep information repositories? We talked before in the previous chapter about centers of excellence or project management offices, for example. But there needs to be ways of making sure that the information that we are creating or using does not just get lost. Chances are, if you learn something in an organization, somebody on another project can probably make use of it as well. So having standards for sharing information, for putting documents in place, things as simple as procurement and procedures for allocating funding, all these things are organizational standards and help us to be efficient. Next, we're going to get into project and product life cycles. Whether it's a project or a product, it's good to break development into phases, into life cycles. Why is that? Well, it's good to be able to build into projects or products things we call kill points, or even points for evaluation. A kill point means that we realize the project is not going to achieve what it was meant to achieve, or it's beyond the scope or the price point we were hoping for, or the time frame we were hoping for. In addition, phases also give us chances to review where we're at to see if we do need to make changes. For example, you would never, if you were preparing a big meal, you wouldn't start the turkey cooking and then check on it 5 hours later without ever looking in the oven. You wouldn't do the same for a project either, because it costs a lot of money and it requires a lot of commitment from the organization. You could say the same thing if you're developing a product, if you are checking back in on it from time to time. So what is a project life cycle? What that basically means is we've got a series of phases. It's linear, goes directly. When are you doing what work, how? And where do you have deliverables? Where do you have points where you actually have to produce something that shows the work is getting done? For that matter, who's doing the work and what is the work costing? Here's something else to keep in mind is processes and project lifecycle phases can also cross over. Meaning you might have tasks 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and all of a sudden tasks 1 and 4 are hitting at the same time because of the way a process works. Just like when you're cooking your turkey, for example, you may have the celery stuffing, and the carrots that get done at the same time, even though you started the turkey first. So it comes down to when things are done cooking. At the end of the phase, what you have that you can show that you've accomplished something. It doesn't necessarily have to be physical, but a deliverable. The deliverable could be that we created a project plan for the next phase. The deliverable could be that the code was written. The deliverable could be that a prototype for our autonomous car is complete. Well, we complete those as part of a project life cycle. So basically, when we start planning, the earlier phases of a project tend to have the greatest level of uncertainty and the lowest level of actual resources. This is where we plan. The more time we spend planning, the more time and probably budget we spend planning, the more smoothly our execution phases tend to go. By the time we've reached the middle phases where the project is actually executing, hopefully you've got some certainty. Hopefully the project is actually rolling out, but you're also going to be expending resources at that point. The last part of a project, and this is an oversimplification, is where we basically make sure that everything we set out to do got accomplished and that somebody is signing off. So all of these things all tie together. So products also fit in the same boat when we start talking about life cycles. We start talking about product life cycles. In this case, we're talking about IT, but it really can apply to any product. Some of the systems development life cycle processes we're going to talk about here are geared towards software or systems. But really, the general idea is not that different than project management in general. So what we refer to generally is the systems development life cycle. If you are an MIS student or a computer science student, you've no doubt heard of this. Well, all this means, guys, is that we've got a life cycle for initiating and completing technology projects. And there's a number of them. We'll talk at length about some of these between the predictive, iterative, incremental, adaptive, and hybrid life cycles. I don't mean to not spend a lot of time on these, but to me, the general theory of project management gets a lot more specific in these areas. If we were teaching a systems analysis and design course, we dive into these more specifically. We are, however, going to be speaking at a 30,000-foot view about some of these life cycles. The most traditional model in terms of a predictive life cycle model, meaning you can have a pretty good idea how the project is going to roll out, is what we refer to as the waterfall model. You'll see an illustration of this in the coming slides. It is the most traditional, longest, and arguably in modern times the least quick or least efficient method. If you have endless time to do wonderfully well planned out testing, the waterfall model is in distinct phases and might be your cup of tea. The spiral model, for example, means that we use an iterative process so that we are creating and revising at the same time. You'll see that in the model as we go on. Prototyping and rapid application development are similar types of approaches, meaning that you are, for example, in prototypes, you're creating what we refer to as straw men, or things that we can evaluate and tear down. In a waterfall model, we're creating fundamentally sound code, for example, where in a prototyping model, we might be creating software and then revising it as we go. For example, Microsoft Windows, which this recording is being produced on, has thousands of lines of bad code. If you want to know why they have to do system upgrades or patches, it's because this software was not perfect when it was developed. It was developed and designed in such a way to get it to market as quickly as possible while still having a reliable product. And that's a product of one of these other types of life cycle models, and probably not waterfall. So for example, the waterfall model, it goes through very rigid, very standardized processes: analysis, design, construction, testing, and support. Where in the spiral model, you might be doing all of these phases back and forth. It's not as linear. So that predictive life cycle means that you are going to anticipate there will be errors, but it tends to move more quickly. So let's go back to phases. We'll be talking more about the systems development life cycle as well. But what's the importance of phases? As I mentioned before, you've got to have project phases so that we can review progress, so that we can see where we are at a given time. Have we made progress? Are we hitting our deliverables? If you've got management who's actively involved in your projects, they also will probably want to have an opportunity to examine progress and ask questions, make suggestions. Now, when we get into these project reviews, they can change the course of the project. They can cause us to change the scope. There could be points where we realize that we are over budget, for example, and that's a good time to ask for additional funding. That all being said, if you've got management who are involved in your projects, I would involve them more frequently just at the end of phases. By the end of a phase, there's no more time to make changes within that phase. If you get to the end of a project phase and report out to management you're $50,000 over budget, the first comment from management might be, why didn't we know about this? So again, to quote our slide, it's not wise to wait to the end of a phase to bring up a problem. So in terms of the points that our text regularly makes is the more that you have people checking in on project work to make sure from a managerial standpoint that it is satisfying the goals and the objectives of the organization, the better off we will be. We've discussed some of the Department of Homeland Security projects, for example, that resulted in billions of dollars of spending without any discernible deliverables. Who was keeping the project team and the project itself on task and accountable? And that's why we need to have periodic phases or places where we check in. When our text talks about the idea of context for IT projects, what we're really talking about is, in terms of the approaches to the systems development lifecycle, which works best. Let me give you an example. If we had a government research project and we are well funded and not under any pressure to produce an experimental piece of software or an experimental device, then a waterfall type systems development methodology might be perfect for our laid back, non-time sensitive environment. Might not work so well if you're working for Microsoft, who's under the deadline to produce code for a phone to compete with Apple, as Apple is slipping in market share and we're seeing an opportunity. So again, there are unique aspects to managing projects within the IT context. For those of you who don't work in IT, keep in mind a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about in this section is still relevant to other disciplines as well. So IT projects themselves, though, can be very large, they can be complicated, and because of the diversity in technology and because of the granularity of much of the technology now, granularity meaning complex code, multiple components, suppliers from multiple vendors, this could be a very difficult and complex process. And so if you're getting into software, it's more complicated even than hardware because of the level of customizable options and everything else. So the other part of this is because IT is everywhere these days. We're talking about ubiquitous types of problems and components, software, and hardware that are used throughout industries, meaning there's a lot of options, there's a lot of vendors, there's a lot of choices. So IT team members, I try to avoid stereotyping, but IT people tend to be somewhat analytical. They tend to be people who are specialists or thinking in a given area. They can be somewhat myopic, for example. When I say this, I know I've got some IT people or MIS majors in this class, but we do tend to focus on areas that we are interested in. I think it's a great idea to mix folks who are from the IT discipline with people from other disciplines, folks who maybe think at a bigger picture kind of scale. For example, sometimes people who work in IT have a hard time adapting to management because they need to look outside the realm of expertise and to be able to see things from perspectives that are not technical. So it can be very difficult to make that jump. I would encourage you that if you do have a project team and you're doing IT work, to include non-IT members in the team. Conversely, if you're doing a project that involves the organization and IT is not typically involved in your decision-making process, include them as well. They may have some very interesting perspectives to offer to any committee. So one of the other challenges about this kind of project management is that we've got technology that's changing very rapidly, and on top of that, I like throwing this in too, various generations in the workforce use technology in different ways to communicate. If you are a millennial, for example, if you're a millennial or a member of Gen Z, your primary method of communication and preferred method might be texting. If you're a Gen Xer like me, you might be comfortable texting, but still prefer email for longer communication. If you're a traditionalist or a baby boomer, you may still appreciate in-person meetings and face-to-face conversations. None of these things are wrong, but they're different between individuals. And we'll talk more about that when it gets to communications management as well. But we're also upgrading our technology more frequently these days, which adds to the complexity of information technology management, project management. So what are some of the trends that are affecting us? Well, we are the world, as it's spoken, and as a result, some of the support services we're using are no longer based in our home country. We refer to that as outsourcing or offshoring. In addition, we might be working with teams from multiple locations, multiple time zones, and speaking multiple languages. I would be surprised, for those of you who are working in the United States, that you won't be dealing with somebody whose primary language is not English. You may be speaking to somebody in a second language. You yourself may be bilingual as well. It's the changing nature and the increasingly connected world we live in. And in addition, we are adapting more agile methods of project management, meaning we're rapid-fire, adaptable forms of project management. So what are some of the issues? Well, just communicating. For example, there are cultural differences in the way we communicate. If we're communicating in text, whether we're using text messaging or email, for example, things like humor do not translate well. It's tough to build trust with people you don't meet in person. Common work practices in certain cultures. For example, the United States, we work the longest workday in the civilized world. It may not be fathomable to some of our colleagues in other countries that we're going to work on the weekend, for example. Our tools, how we translating between each other, how are we communicating? Are we using email? Are we using some sort of project management software? Are we using Microsoft SharePoint, for example? I think the solutions to these things are openness and a willingness to learn, ultimately. Let me give you an example, though, about how work sometimes doesn't cross cultures. There was a situation where a company, in this case it was actually a meatpacking plant, opened operations in the Southern Hemisphere, in South America. They were paying above market wages to employees, and the management there went against the norms in the region and actually asked employees to offer suggestions to management to take part in helping run the company and deciding how the company would move forth. Their turnover rate at this company, despite the fact they were including their employees in decision making and paying above market wages, was nearly 100%. They could not keep people. When they asked departing employees why they were leaving and did an in-depth analysis, many of these employees assumed that because the managers were asking for opinions and for asking for their input, that they were incompetent and that the company was in peril of closing. So sometimes one culture to the next, we view scenarios very differently. So you've got to think globally here as well. When I say think globally but act locally, think about everybody you're working with, control the folks that you can, work with the folks, elicit change where you can. So again, outsourcing can be unpopular, but it's also not inherently a dirty word. We outsource not only to eliminate jobs, but to also sometimes to bring in specialties or to bring in skill sets that we don't have in our own organization, potentially for limited periods of time. So project managers need to know how to work this and how to integrate these kinds of approaches into our process as well without alienating their own staff to make effective use of outsourcing. That gets us into virtual teams. As we were discussing, there are advantages and disadvantages. The advantages of virtual teams is people can work from anywhere. They can work flexible work schedules, and we as employers don't have to worry about paying for as much office space. Pretty good, right? Well, some of the disadvantages is some people don't work well on their own. They feel isolated. In fact, I telecommuted for a period of time and found out I was actually working more. In addition, if there's an internet outage, how much work is actually being done? I think that for folks who do choose to have a distributed workforce, encouraging those individuals to maintain a schedule, to maintain a kind of a work mentality is helpful. I know that when I was telecommuting, I would still get up in the morning and I would drive to my local coffee shop, grab my coffee and my breakfast, come back and get to work and work a normal schedule. I did that to make sure I maintained a routine and it still felt like I was going to work. Other people are great with being able to work less traditional schedules. One of the other challenges, however, though, is availability for individuals who are largely working on their own schedules. So when we start talking about Agile, the general term means that we are being able to respond quickly, and it means that we are able to respond to quick changes. Some folks, however, are not big fans of it when it comes down to project management, IT project management. As I mentioned earlier, the most fundamental method of software development and technology development is the old waterfall model. These days, we're doing more rapid-fire collaboration and, forgive the term, but throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks at times. So there are a number of folks who have bought in very much to the idea of agile software development. And what this basically means, the long and short is that we have more folks collaborating more quickly to do things like develop code or components or parts of systems in a way where we're doing more than one thing at a time, maybe even developing multiple phases of a project or system at the same time with input from multiple areas. Again, the example is, why does Microsoft Windows ship with so many lines of defective code? It's because it's no longer developed in a traditional waterfall model. Then we also get into another kind of agile type approach, rapid fire computing development, which we refer to as Scrum. And Scrum comes from rugby terminology, meaning that we have periods of preparation punctuated by other periods of massive activity. So we look here, for example, a basic Scrum. Some of the terminology can be a little misleading too, that we have the person who's controlling the product, the person who's maintaining the project, who we call the product owner. And they're the person who develops what we refer to as a product backlog. That's the list of attributes or functionalities we want to see in the product. At that point, the project team works on creating it and they sprint the backlog. They have daily meetings, and the general time frame is a 2 to 4 week sprint where people are doing very rapid fire development. And you basically keep on repeating the process until you've got a useful product. What's different about this iterative process? It's a back and forth model as opposed to traditional waterfall development where you would start and have a linear start and finish to your project. Some Japanese management professionals have converted this technique to what we call Kanban, which basically means a very similar process to Scrum, but instead of using Scrum analogies, they're using things like icons to be able to graphically guide people forward and backwards. And they refer to them as Kanban cards, so we can show where the work has been completed or is a work in process. And again, I include this mainly for your information. The guide itself, when we refer to the PMBOK guide, it gives us the PMP as a standard. The PMI is Project Management Institute gives us the PMBOK guide as a standard for project management. But when we refer to things like Agile or Waterfall, those are methodologies to how to manage projects, not standards. So you can have a methodology and a standard. So let it be said that basically the Project Management Institute knows that there's an interest in changing the way we do development, and that things like waterfall development are really not the way of the future based on the rapid fire response required in the market these days. So to give us a summary of this chapter, we're talking about systems. Organizations have systems and structural frames, and different approaches work for different organizations. So depending on your culture and your organizational layout, different methods of project management, different approaches to systems development may work better. In addition, the culture of the organization can often override the design or layout of the organization. Even if it's a well-designed organization using good systems, the culture sometimes can derail it. We're also talking now about a more global culture and the challenges that come with a global culture as well, using virtual teams. And some of the newer methodologies for rapid-fire agile software development, things like Scrum, are being recognized by PMIs as areas worthy of study. Thank you again for your time and attention. I hope you have a great day.